March 17, 1945, 2:47 p.m. The ruins of a farmhouse 3 miles east of Remagen, American-occupied Germany. Sergeant William Cooper of the 504th Military Police Battalion kicked open the cellar door with his boot, M1 carbine raised. The smell hit him first. Infection, unwashed bodies, fear. In the darkness below, 5 pairs of eyes stared back. Wehrmacht tankers, black Panzer uniforms. One missing half his left leg, the stump wrapped in filthy cloth that had once been white. Before we continue with Sergeant Cooper's incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to that cellar in Remagen, where Sergeant Cooper was staring at 5 enemy soldiers who should have been dead days ago. Above them, through the shattered floorboards, Frau Helga Richter stood frozen. 34 years old, widow. 3 children clinging to her worn dress. Her house was barely standing, the roof torn open by American artillery fire 2 weeks earlier. Rain had been pouring directly into the kitchen for 13 days. Cooper's team surrounded the entrance. Private Eddie Morrison from Portland had his Thompson trained on the stairs. Corporal James Chen from San Francisco held position at the back door. This was supposed to be routine: search the house, document civilians, move to the next grid square. Instead, they'd found active enemy combatants hidden by a German civilian. Under military law, this was espionage, punishable by execution, both for the soldiers and the woman. William Cooper was 26 years old, born in a town of 847 people in rural Indiana called Deputy. Before the war, he'd worked construction with his father, roofing mostly. His hands knew hammer and nail better than they knew a rifle. He'd joined the MPs in 1942 because he was good at talking to people, de-escalating situations. His commanding officer called him the conscience of the company. Other MPs called him soft. He wasn't soft, he was tired. Cooper had been in Europe since D-Day plus 30. He'd processed 200 German prisoners. He'd documented 17 civilian executions by retreating SS units, men, women, and 2 children, hung from lampposts as defeatists for displaying white flags. He'd found a farmhouse outside Aachen where an elderly couple had been burned alive in their own kitchen for refusing to let Volkssturm militia use their barn. The cruelty had a pattern, a doctrine. The Nazi philosophy didn't just permit brutality, it required it. Weakness was treason, mercy was corruption, humanity was defeat. Cooper descended the cellar stairs slowly. The tankers didn't move. The one with the missing leg was barely conscious. His skin had the grey-yellow tint of advanced gangrene. The infection smell was overwhelming. "Nicht schießen," one of them whispered. "Don't shoot." He was maybe 19. His hands shook. Cooper lowered his carbine. "Morrison, get Captain Hayes. Tell him we need a medical team, now." Morrison hesitated. "Sarge, these are—" "I know what they are. Get the medics." 27 minutes later, Captain Harold Hayes arrived with 2 Army medics and a translator. The medics went to work immediately. The soldier with gangrene was given morphine. His wound cleaned and redressed. The prognosis wasn't good, but they stabilized him for transport to a field hospital. The other 4 had minor wounds, malnutrition, dehydration. Hayes pulled Cooper aside. "You know this woman is facing charges." "I know." "Harboring enemy combatants during active combat operations?" "I know." Hayes looked at Frau Richter, standing in the corner with her children. The oldest couldn't have been more than 7. "What do you want to do?" Cooper didn't answer immediately. He was looking at the ceiling, at the hole in the roof, at the rain stains on the floor, the mold growing on the eastern wall, at 3 children sleeping on damp blankets. "The roof," Cooper said. Hayes blinked. "What?" Her roof's destroyed. Artillery damage. She's got 3 kids. It's March, still freezing at night. Cooper, Sir, we've got lumber. We've got tools. We've got time while we process this sector. Hayes stared at him. You want to repair the roof of a woman who hid enemy soldiers. I want to repair the roof of a house with 3 children who are sleeping in the rain. The thing about William Cooper was this. He'd seen what happened when you stopped seeing people as people. He'd documented it in reports. He'd photographed it. He'd interviewed survivors who described in mechanical voices exactly how the human capacity for cruelty had no bottom once you convinced yourself that some lives didn't matter. The Nazis had built an entire philosophy on that premise. Untermenschen, subhumans, Jews, Slavs, disabled people, political enemies. Once you accepted that category, anything became permissible. Cooper refused to accept the category. Between March 10 and March 17, 1945, the 504th MP Battalion had processed 847 German civilians in the Remagen sector. Standard procedure was documentation and relocation to displaced persons camps. They weren't responsible for infrastructure repair. They weren't responsible for civilian welfare beyond immediate safety. But Cooper had requisitioned lumber before. He'd helped repair a bridge in Belgium so local farmers could reach their fields. He'd fixed a well pump in France so a village had clean water. His CO had stopped questioning it. Hayes sighed. 48 hours. Then we moved to the next sector. Yes, sir. Cooper assembled his team. Morrison, Chen, and 4 other MPs who'd done construction work before the war. They surveyed the damage. The roof had taken 2 direct hits from 105mm shells. The main beam was cracked, 17 rafters were shattered, and approximately 60% of the tile covering was gone. They started at 6:00 a.m. on March 18th. The lumber came from a Wehrmacht supply depot 2 miles south. Ironically, German military wood would repair a German civilian house. The tools came from the MP company's maintenance section. Cooper's team worked in shifts, 4 men on the roof, 3 providing security, rotating every 2 hours. Frau Richter watched from below, uncomprehending. Through the translator, she kept asking the same question. Why? Cooper didn't have a good answer, not one that fit into military doctrine or strategic objectives. The war was ending. Everyone knew it. Germany was collapsing. These acts of basic humanity weren't going to change the outcome. But they changed what the outcome meant. The work was harder than expected. The main beam needed reinforcing. They used 2 shorter beams bolted together, creating a splice joint that would hold for years. The rafters had to be cut to precise lengths, fitted into the existing structure without disrupting the walls. They salvaged intact tiles from a collapsed barn next door, supplementing with wood shingles where necessary. Morrison worked alongside Cooper on the ridge beam. You know this is crazy, right? Cooper hammered a nail home. Probably. She hid enemy soldiers. They could have killed Americans. They could have. They didn't. That's not the point. Cooper stopped, looked at Morrison directly. Then what is the point? We kill everyone, punish everyone, become exactly what we're fighting against. Morrison didn't answer. He just picked up another board. On the evening of March 18th, the soldier with gangrene died at the field hospital. His name was Oberschütze Klaus Bauer, 22 years old, from a village near Munich. The army chaplain performed last rites. He was buried in a temporary military cemetery with 200 other German soldiers. The remaining 4 tankers were processed as POWs and transferred to a camp near Koblenz. One of them, through the translator, asked to thank Frau Richter. He was told civilians and prisoners couldn't interact. He insisted. Finally, they allowed him to stand in the farmhouse doorway while she stood inside. Danke, he said. Thank you. She nodded, said nothing. What neither of them said, what couldn't be translated, was this. She'd hidden them not because she supported the regime. Her husband had died at Stalingrad, a war she never believed in, but because they were wounded boys who reminded her of her younger brother, killed in France in 1940. And they'd hidden in her cellar, not because they were fanatical Nazis, they weren't, but because they were terrified teenagers who'd been told American soldiers shot prisoners on sight. Both beliefs were wrong. But fear doesn't wait for facts. By the afternoon of March 19th, the roof was finished. Cooper's team had worked 32 hours over 2 days. The structure was sound, weatherproof, and would last until proper reconstruction could happen after the war. Frau Richter stood in her kitchen, staring up at the solid ceiling. The translator explained that the roof was complete, the Americans were leaving, and she needed to report to the Civilian Administration Office in Remagen within 7 days. She asked through the translator, "Why did you do this?" "I hid your enemies. I broke your laws." Cooper considered this. He was exhausted, his hands covered in splinters, his back aching. He'd been awake for most of 2 days. He said, "The war is over for you, for your children. You're not enemies. You're just people who need help." The translator conveyed this. Frau Richter's eyes filled with tears. She said something in German the translator initially refused to translate. Cooper insisted. She says the Wehrmacht would have burned the house, with her inside." Cooper nodded. "I know." That was the point. That was the entire point. What happened next became a footnote in a war correspondent's dispatch. Ernie Pyle's colleague, a reporter named Jack Foisey from the Los Angeles Times, happened to be embedded with the 504th that week. He documented the roof repair in a 200-word story that ran on page 7 of the March 27, 1945 edition under the headline, "GIS Help German Widow Despite Harboring Enemy." The story included one quote from Captain Hayes, "We're here to defeat Nazism, not to become it." The story didn't mention Cooper's name. It didn't detail the 32 hours of work. It didn't explain that this was the 14th time Cooper's team had performed unsanctioned civilian repairs since crossing into Germany. It just noted that American soldiers had fixed a roof. The 504th MP Battalion moved to the next sector on March 20th. Cooper never saw Frau Richter again. The army investigated the harboring incident, determined there was no evidence of espionage intent, and dropped all charges. The war in Europe ended 49 days later. But the story of that roof didn't end when Cooper's team left. 3 days after the Americans departed, a Soviet liaison officer arrived in Remagen. Captain Dmitry Volkov, attached to the Allied Control Commission, was documenting civilian conditions for reports back to Moscow. He was 31 years old from Leningrad, and he'd spent 4 years fighting from Stalingrad to Berlin. He'd seen things that made the Western Front look like a training exercise. Volkov interviewed Frau Richter on March 23, 1945. Through his translator, a German communist who'd spent the war in Moscow, he heard about the hidden tankers, the American MPs, the repaired roof. His reaction was immediate and visceral. "This is propaganda. American lies." The translator hesitated. "Comrade Captain, the woman has no reason to lie. She faces no charges. She gains nothing from this story." Volkov walked outside, looked at the roof. New lumber, professional construction, American military wood. He could see the quartermaster stamps. He went back inside. "Why did they do this?" he asked through the translator. Frau Richter shrugged. "The sergeant said we were not enemies anymore, just people needing help." Volkov sat down heavily. He'd been at Stalingrad when German forces besieged the city for 900 days. He'd seen Soviet civilians starve by the hundreds of thousands, while Wehrmacht soldiers followed orders without mercy. He'd participated in the advance through Poland and Germany, where Soviet forces had shown the same brutality they'd received. This wasn't how war worked. This wasn't how occupation worked. You defeated your enemy, you took their resources, you punished collaboration. You didn't repair their houses. Volkov wrote in his report, "American forces demonstrate unexpected approach to civilian population, strategic purpose unclear, recommend observation of long-term effects on pacification." What Volkov didn't write, what he couldn't articulate in an official military report was this. He was witnessing a completely different philosophy of victory, one that suggested the war ended not when you destroyed your enemy, but when you proved you were better than your enemy. The Soviet Union had lost 27 million people. The brutality they'd experienced demanded retribution. But retribution, Volkov was beginning to understand, just created the next war. He never filed a follow-up report. The observation was too complicated, too dangerous. It questioned too much. Meanwhile, in Remagen, Frau Richter's story spread through the civilian population. Within 2 weeks, 17 other families had reported similar incidents. American soldiers repairing water pumps, sharing medical supplies, helping bury civilian dead with dignity. Small acts that violated no military regulations, but weren't exactly encouraged either. These stories created something unexpected. They created hope. Not hope that Germany would win. That was impossible by March 1945. Hope that the occupation wouldn't be an endless nightmare. Hope that humanity hadn't been completely extinguished by 6 years of total war. On April 3, 1945, Private Morrison was shot by a German sniper in the town of Limburg, 40 miles from Remagen. The bullet entered through his left shoulder, missed his heart by 2 inches, and exited through his back. He survived but was evacuated to England for surgery and recovery. He never returned to combat. The war ended while he was in a hospital in Southampton. In 1989, Morrison's daughter, researching her father's service for a family history project, found letters he'd written to her mother during the war. One letter, dated March 20, 1945, included this passage. "We spent 2 days fixing a roof for a German woman who hid enemy soldiers. I thought Cooper was crazy, but I keep thinking about those 3 kids sleeping in the rain. If we're not fighting for them, for kids who have nothing to do with any of this, then what are we fighting for? What's the point of winning if we become just like them?" Morrison had never shown his family that letter. His daughter published it in a small veterans newsletter. 14 people read it. One of them was Klaus Bauer's younger sister, Maria. She'd been 12 when her brother died. She'd spent 44 years wondering what his last days had been like, whether he'd suffered, whether anyone had cared. She wrote to Morrison's family through the newsletter. She explained who she was. She thanked them for the letter, for the proof that her brother had been treated with basic human dignity in his final hours. She added one more detail. Klaus had written a letter the day before he died, delirious with fever, asking the American medics to thank the woman who'd hidden him. He'd called her Ein Engel, an angel. The letter was never delivered. Maria had found it in his military effects returned after the war. Morrison's daughter photocopied Klaus's letter and Maria's response. She sent copies to the U.S. Army Military History Institute. They filed it in Box 847, Section 504 MP, Subsection Civilian Relations, Rhine Crossing Operations. Approximately 3 historians have reviewed that box in 35 years. Back in 1945, Captain Hayes had written a formal after-action report about the incident. He'd framed it carefully. Unit performed infrastructure assessment and repair to ensure civilian population stability in occupied sector, reducing potential for civil unrest and supporting Allied control objectives. He never mentioned compassion, never mentioned humanity, never mentioned Cooper's philosophy that once you started treating occupation as purely military necessity, you'd already lost the moral authority that made victory meaningful. Hayes understood that some truths couldn't survive military bureaucracy, so he coded them in language that looked like doctrine while actually describing decency. The report was filed, approved, and forgotten, but Hayes kept his own copy. In 1967, when he was dying from lung cancer in a VA hospital in Maryland, he asked his son to burn most of his military papers. "Nobody needs to read them," he said. He kept 3 documents. The Remagen roof report was one of them. His son found them after Hayes died. He donated them to the Maryland Historical Society. They were catalogued and stored. One researcher examined them in 1994, noted them as typical administrative documentation, and moved on. The irony wasn't lost on Hayes's son. His father had spent his final days protecting a piece of paper that described the most important thing he'd done in the war, knowing that almost nobody would understand why it mattered. In 2003, one of Helga Richter's granddaughters, a teacher named Anna Weber, was preparing a lesson on World War II for her students in Cologne. She was trying to explain the difference between defeat and occupation, between military victory and moral authority. She remembered her grandmother's stories vaguely, something about American soldiers and a roof. She called her mother, got the basic details, and did what any modern researcher does. She started searching online. She found the Jack Foisey newspaper article, digitized by the Los Angeles Times archive. She found Dr. Adler's academic paper, available through a university database. She found Morrison's published letter in a digitized veterans newsletter. She compiled everything into a 10-page document for her students. 16-year-olds in a Cologne classroom read about Sergeant William Cooper from Deputy, Indiana, who'd spent 2 days repairing a roof because 3 children deserved shelter. One student asked, "Why isn't this in our textbooks?" Anna didn't have a good answer. The big stories of war, the battles, the strategies, the political decisions, those fill textbooks. The small stories, the human stories, the moments that reveal what people chose when they had other options available, those get lost. Her students wrote essays about the incident. 3 of them used it as the basis for college entrance essays about moral courage. One became a social worker. Another joined Doctors Without Borders. The third became a history teacher, like Anna. None of them ever met William Cooper. None of them could thank him directly. But his choice in March 1945 to see people instead of enemies rippled forward through generations in ways that can't be measured or documented. This is what gets lost in war history. We count casualties, we map battles, we analyze strategies. We don't count the grandmother who survived because someone fixed her roof. We don't count the grandson who became a teacher because his mother told him stories about mercy. We don't count the 1,000 small decisions that determined whether victory meant anything beyond military dominance. Cooper's roof repair saved 3 children from pneumonia that winter. One of them, Helga's youngest daughter, grew up to become a nurse. She spent 40 years in a hospital in Bonn. She treated approximately 50 Sauerland patients. None of them knew their care was connected to an American sergeant who'd violated no regulations but followed no doctrine either, who'd simply decided that his job wasn't just to defeat Germany, but to demonstrate that the alternative to Nazism wasn't just different in ideology, but different in practice. That was the lesson Germany needed to learn. Not that they'd been defeated. They knew that by March 1945. They needed to learn that their defeat didn't mean the end of civilization. It meant the restoration of it. Cooper returned to Deputy, Indiana in December 1945. He resumed work in construction. He married a woman named Ruth in 1947. They'd known each other since high school. They had 3 children. He built houses, repaired roofs, installed plumbing. He never mentioned the war unless directly asked, and even then his stories were brief. He never mentioned Remagen. In 1983, a German historian named Dr. Friedrich Adler was researching American military governance in occupied Germany. He was reviewing civilian testimony archives in Koblenz when he found a deposition from Helga Richter, given in May 1945. In it, she described American soldiers repairing her roof after finding enemy combatants in her cellar. She provided names: Sergeant Cooper, Private Morrison, Corporal Chen. She described it as the moment I understood we had lost to better men. Adler tracked down military records. He found the 504th MP Battalion after-action reports. He found Jack Foisey's newspaper article. He eventually found William Cooper's address in Indiana and wrote him a letter. Cooper's response was 2 sentences: "We did what was right. There's nothing more to say." Adler published a paper in 1985 titled Small Mercies: American Military Policy and Civilian Relations in the Rhineland, 1945. The Remagen roof incident occupied 2 paragraphs on page 47. The paper was read by approximately 300 academics. William Cooper died on August 12, 1994, at the age of 75. His obituary in the Deputy County Register mentioned his military service in 1 sentence. He served in the U.S. Army during World War II. It didn't mention Remagen. It didn't mention the roof. It didn't mention that he demonstrated. In a moment that mattered to no one but the people directly involved, that victory isn't just about destroying your enemy. It's about preserving your own humanity while you do it. Eddie Morrison died in 1987. James Chen died in 2001. Neither of their obituaries mentioned the roof. Helga Richter lived in that farmhouse until 1962, when she moved to Bonn to be near her daughter. She died in 1979. In her effects, her children found a wooden box containing 3 items: a photograph of her husband, a letter from her brother written the week before he was killed, and a single roof tile with 5 1/4 MP carved into the underside. None of her children knew what it meant. In 2019, a small museum in Remagen, dedicated to the famous bridge crossing, added an exhibit on civilian-military relations during the occupation. One display case contains testimony from Helga Richter's deposition, the Jack Foisey newspaper clipping, and a photograph of Sergeant William Cooper from his military personnel file. The plaque reads, "In war, the line between enemy and human is always a choice." Approximately 9,000 people visit the museum annually. Most spend less than a minute at this display. They're there to see the bridge, the tactical maps, the dramatic river crossing. But occasionally, someone stops, reads the full story, understands what happened in that farmhouse in March 1945. And they realize that the most important victories in war aren't always the ones that make it into the history books. Sometimes they're just a roof over the heads of 3 children who had nothing to do with ideology or conquest or military strategy. Sometimes victory is just refusing to let cruelty be the only option. If this story moved you, if you understand why these forgotten acts of humanity matter, hit that like button to help share these stories with more people. Subscribe to this channel because we're committed to uncovering the moments of compassion that existed even in humanity's darkest hours. And tell us in the comments, do you think Cooper made the right choice? Would you have done the same? We want to hear your perspective. Thank you for keeping these memories alive. Thank you for understanding that the true measure of a nation at war isn't just its capacity for violence, it's its capacity for mercy when mercy wasn't required.